One press moment nearly shattered Allied command. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It didn't happen under fire. It happened in front of microphones, maps still warm from the last briefing, while the war was very much unfinished. One victory, two generals, and one claim that set Allied headquarters on fire. Bernard Montgomery stepped into the spotlight and spoke as if the breakthrough belonged to him. Not shared, not collective, his. And somewhere else in Europe, George Patton understood immediately what that meant. It wasn't just insulting, it wasn't even surprising, it was dangerous. Because in 1944, credit was not about pride, credit was about control. And inside Allied headquarters, control decided who moved, who waited, and who ran out of fuel while the enemy regrouped. This was not a feud between personalities. That's the version history likes because it's tidy. Two egos, two flags, one rivalry. But that version misses the real threat. The real threat was what happens when narrative outruns trust. Montgomery knew how to speak to power. He knew how to frame events so that they hardened into facts before anyone could challenge them. When he described the breakthrough, he wasn't just summarizing events, he was defining ownership. And ownership inside a coalition war is never symbolic. Patton didn't hear arrogance, he heard displacement. Because once a breakthrough is claimed, everything that follows bends toward the claimant. Supply routes, strategic priority, political confidence, the next offensive, the future shape of command. And that's why this moment mattered more than the fighting that produced it. Allied headquarters was already fragile. It was a machine held together by compromise, national pride, and the shared terror of failure. Americans and British officers worked side by side, but they did not think the same way. They did not trust the same instincts, and they did not imagine the same post-war world. So when Montgomery spoke, it wasn't a single sentence, it was a wedge. Because if Montgomery owned the breakthrough, then Montgomery owned the momentum. And if Montgomery owned the momentum, American commanders were no longer leading the war forward. They were supporting someone else's vision of how it should be fought. This is where the story turns personal fast. Patton did not see himself as a subordinate instrument. He saw himself as the engine. Speed, aggression, pressure. That was his identity. That was his legitimacy. Take away the public acknowledgement of success, and you didn't just bruise his ego. You questioned his right to command independently. Inside headquarters, perception was reality, and perception was now shifting. Montgomery, calm and deliberate, understood something many generals never grasped. Wars are remembered before they are finished. The story forms while the outcome is still undecided. And whoever controls that story controls the confidence of politicians, the patience of allies, and the latitude to demand resources. Patton understood something else. Once that latitude is gone, it never comes back. This is why the reaction was immediate. American officers didn't see Montgomery's claim as optimism or confidence. They saw it as annexation. A British general absorbing an American success into his personal and national portfolio. And the worst part was that it worked. There was no dramatic confrontation in that moment, no shouting match, no slammed doors. Just a quiet, collective realization inside HQ that the balance had shifted slightly, and that slight shift would ripple outward. Because from that moment on, every planning meeting carried an unspoken question. Whose war is this now? Coalition warfare depends on the illusion of unity. Everyone knows it's imperfect, but as long as the illusion holds, momentum survives. Once the illusion cracks, decisions slow. Motives get questioned, and every order feels like leverage instead of leadership. This was not an abstract fear. Allied operations required speed. German defenses were elastic, adaptive, and dangerous when given time. Any pause, any delay, any argument inside headquarters translated directly into enemy survival. And now, instead of shared urgency, there was suspicion. Montgomery believed order won wars. Patton believed chaos, properly directed, shattered enemies. Both had evidence. Both had victories. But headquarters could not afford to choose between them. It needed both operating at full strength. Instead, it got Rivalry. This is why that press moment mattered. Not because it offended Patton, not because it flattered Montgomery, but because it turned success into a contested resource. And once success becomes contested, unity becomes conditional. The real battlefield was no longer the front line. It was inside headquarters. Officers began reading statements more carefully. Silence became meaningful. Praise became political. Even agreement felt temporary. And all of it stemmed from a single idea taking root: that one general was positioning himself above the coalition rather than within it. Montgomery would later insist he was misunderstood, that he was simply clarifying that unity required a single guiding hand. But intent mattered less than effect, and the effect was clear. Trust eroded quietly, and erosion is always more dangerous than collapse because no one reacts until the damage is done. Patton, for his part, didn't lash out publicly. That would have confirmed every fear about his temperament. Instead, his anger hardened into resolve. If credit could be taken, then momentum had to be undeniable. If narrative could be manipulated, then results had to overwhelm the story. That determination would push him harder, faster, more aggressively, which only deepened the divide. Because now, headquarters wasn't just managing a It was managing a rivalry that threatened to turn operational decisions into political statements. And the enemy didn't need to understand any of this. They only needed time. That's why this moment deserves attention, not as gossip, not as personality drama, but as a warning. When credit becomes a weapon, it doesn't just wound pride, it reshapes command, it changes behavior, and it moves the real fight away from the front line. The Allies would win the war. History makes that feel inevitable. But inside headquarters, nothing felt inevitable at all. To understand why the reaction was so sharp, you have to understand what the breakthrough actually represented. Not in theory, in practice. A breakthrough wasn't just a line on a map being crossed. It was a rupture in the enemy's ability to cope. It meant German reserves were late, confused, or misdirected. It meant roads opened, flanks loosened, and movement became possible again after weeks of grinding constraints. Most importantly, it meant momentum. Momentum decided everything. Which formations advanced, which ones waited, who received fuel first when supply lines were stretched thin, who got replacements, air support, bridging equipment, priority rail access. A breakthrough didn't just move armies forward, it rearranged the hierarchy inside headquarters. And everyone there knew it. The Americans believed that momentum had been created by speed, by pressure applied relentlessly until the enemy couldn't reset. This wasn't accidental, it was doctrinal. Push hard enough, fast enough, and German command systems fractured before they could adapt. Patton embodied that logic. His forces didn't pause to admire success, they exploited it. They turned openings into collapses by refusing to slow down. And when the breakthrough came, American officers saw it as the validation of that philosophy. This wasn't bravado, it was proof of concept. From their perspective, the breakthrough wasn't a British-planned event that Americans merely executed. It was an American-driven rupture that British command now wanted to administrate. That distinction mattered. Because whoever defined the breakthrough defined the narrative of how the war should be fought next. Was it careful, methodical pressure, or was it relentless exploitation? The answer would shape future operations across the entire front. Montgomery's version leaned toward control. The Americans' version leaned toward acceleration. And the battlefield evidence could support both, which is what made the fight so dangerous. From the outside, the advance looked unified. Allied forces pushing forward, German lines bending, maps changing color. But inside headquarters, the interpretation of why this was happening diverged sharply. To Montgomery, the breakthrough validated preparation. He believed success came from deliberate planning, overwhelming force applied at the right point, and a tight grip on the sequence of operations. In that framework, the breakthrough was not an improvisation. it was the inevitable result of his design. To the Americans, especially Patton, inevitability was an illusion. Success came from aggression, from refusing to wait for perfect conditions, from exploiting chaos faster than the enemy could respond. In that framework, the breakthrough existed because someone was willing to move before permission caught up. Both views had merit. Both were partially true, and that overlap should have been a strength. Instead, it became contested ground. Because when Montgomery described the breakthrough publicly, he wasn't just narrating events. He was embedding his interpretation into the official record. He was anchoring future decisions to his logic. And American commanders saw the implication immediately. If the breakthrough was framed as the result of Montgomery's method, then future operations would follow Montgomery's tempo. Slower, more centralized, more controlled. That wasn't just a disagreement, it was a strategic fork in the road. Inside HQ, officers understood that wars are won by momentum, but lost by mismanagement of success. And now success itself was being redefined. This is where the Americans felt something slipping. Not territory, not prestige, authority. Because authority in a coalition is fragile. It isn't enforced by rank alone. It's enforced by perceived effectiveness, by the belief that your way of fighting is producing results. If Montgomery owned the breakthrough, then Montgomery owned the proof. And that meant American commanders would increasingly be asked to support rather than lead, to execute rather than shape, to provide force without controlling direction. Patton saw that future clearly, and he rejected it completely. To him, the breakthrough was not a checkpoint, it was a launch point. Pause too long, reorganize too carefully, and the enemy recovers. History had taught him that. His instincts screamed it. So when he heard Montgomery's claim, he didn't hear confidence. He heard a brake being applied to a machine that needed to keep accelerating. And headquarters felt the tension immediately. Briefings became more guarded. Language became precise to the point of stiffness. Praise was carefully allocated. Success was increasingly attributed to plans rather than commanders. A subtle shift that diluted individual initiative. None of this stopped the advance. Not yet. But it changed the atmosphere in which decisions were made. Because now every movement carried a secondary question. Does this reinforce Montgomery's narrative or contradict it? That's a dangerous question to inject into a war. Because once commanders begin thinking about how actions will be interpreted, rather than how quickly they can be executed, speed dies quietly. And speed was the Allies' greatest advantage. The breakthrough should have unified headquarters around success. Instead, it exposed a fault line that had been there all along. And Montgomery, whether intentionally or instinctively, had just widened it. Montgomery did not take credit by accident. He wasn't careless with words. He wasn't impulsive. And he certainly wasn't unaware of how his statements would land inside Allied headquarters. If anything, he was unusually precise. Every phrase was chosen with the understanding that wars are fought twice, once on the ground and once in the minds of those who decide what happens next. To understand his decision, you have to understand how Montgomery saw the war. He did not believe wars were won by momentum alone. He believed momentum without control was wasteful, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable. In his view, the real task of command was not to move fast, but to move correctly, and to ensure that once movement began, it could be sustained without collapse. That required authority, clear authority, authority that could not be questioned every time something went wrong. Montgomery had learned, the hard way, what happens when authority fractures. He had seen operations fail because commanders argued, hesitated, or pulled in different directions. To him, unity of command was not a political ideal, it was a survival mechanism. And unity, in a coalition, does not emerge naturally, it has to be imposed. This is where narrative becomes a weapon. Montgomery understood that if the breakthrough were framed as his operational success, then future decisions would naturally flow through his headquarters. He wouldn't need to argue for control. It would be assumed. Political leaders would defer. Planners would align. Resistance would soften before it ever became visible. He wasn't stealing credit. He was securing gravity. Because in a coalition war, gravity determines everything. Who others orbit around, who sets tempo, who becomes the default decision-maker when time is short and clarity is scarce. The British position in the alliance made this especially urgent. Britain had experience, but diminishing leverage. The United States had resources, manpower, and growing confidence. Everyone in HQ understood the trajectory. As the war progressed, American influence would only increase. Montgomery saw that future clearly, and he didn't intend to become a junior partner directing someone else's armies. So when the breakthrough came, he saw an opportunity. Not to dominate the Americans, but to stabilize the alliance under a single operational vision, his. From his perspective, allowing multiple commanders to claim ownership of success would lead to fragmentation, competing plans, competing priorities, competing egos pulling the front in different directions. He believed centralization was the cure, and centralization requires legitimacy. That's why sharing credit was never an option. Shared credit creates shared authority, and shared authority creates friction. Montgomery wanted to eliminate friction before it could slow the advance. He believed that once control was established, everyone would benefit. Operations would be cleaner, losses would be lower, progress would be methodical instead of reckless. What he underestimated was the cost, because legitimacy taken is never the same as legitimacy granted. To the Americans, Montgomery's move felt like preemption, like rewriting the story before everyone else had finished telling it. And worse, it felt like a signal that British command no longer trusted American judgment to shape the war's direction. That perception mattered more than Montgomery realized. He believed results would silence criticism. That once operations continued successfully under his framework, resentment would fade, efficiency would vindicate him. But war does not erase memory, it sharpens it. Every subsequent decision was now filtered through suspicion. Every delay reinforced American fears that momentum was being intentionally slowed. Every centralized order felt less like coordination and more like constraint. Montgomery had wanted unity. What he created was compliance without trust. And compliance without trust is brittle. Because the moment something goes wrong, the moment an operation stalls or losses mount, unity collapses instantly. And inside Allied headquarters, everyone knew setbacks were inevitable. Montgomery also misjudged Patton specifically. He saw Patton as talented but volatile, useful but in need of restraint. In Montgomery's mental model, Patton was exactly the kind of commander who benefited from firm oversight, someone whose energy needed direction rather than freedom. What Montgomery failed to grasp was that Patton's effectiveness was inseparable from his autonomy. You could slow Patton down, you could box him in, but you could not do that without also stripping away what made him dangerous to the enemy. By taking credit, Montgomery wasn't just asserting control over the breakthrough. He was redefining the boundaries of acceptable initiative. And that sent a message that could not be walked back. Inside headquarters, the battle lines were now drawn. Not openly, not formally, but psychologically. Montgomery had consolidated authority. Patton had lost narrative ground, and HQ had gained a fault line that would shape every decision moving forward. Because the real battlefield was no longer about terrain. It was about whose philosophy would define victory. Patton did not explode because he was thin-skinned. That's the convenient explanation, the one that fits his reputation. Loud, theatrical, emotional. A general who took things personally because he couldn't separate ego from duty. But that explanation misses the point. Patton reacted because he understood the mechanics of power inside headquarters better than most people gave him credit for. He knew that wars are not directed by the most aggressive commander, but by the one whose judgment is trusted when time runs out. And trust, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. Public credit was not vanity to Patton. It was evidence. Evidence that his way of fighting worked. Evidence that his instincts could be relied upon without constant supervision. Evidence that when he moved fast, he moved correctly. When Montgomery claimed the breakthrough, that evidence evaporated. Patton saw the shift immediately, not in orders, but in tone, in how briefings were framed, in how decisions were justified. Success was no longer attributed to initiative. It was attributed to planning, to structure, to oversight. That wasn't a stylistic disagreement. It was an existential threat to how Patton operated. Because Patton's command legitimacy came from momentum, from the visible collapse of enemy resistance in his wake. Take away the recognition of that momentum, and his autonomy shrinks. And autonomy was everything. Patton believed hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression, that waiting created targets, that the enemy recovered strength during pauses. His entire philosophy was built around denying the opponent time to breathe. Montgomery's approach did the opposite. It prioritized certainty over speed, consolidation over risk. And now that approach was being elevated as the correct interpretation of success. Patton wasn't just angry, he was alarmed. Because if headquarters embraced Montgomery's narrative, then Patton's future operations would be constrained before they even began. Requests for rapid advances would be questioned. Supply priorities would be reassessed. Permission would replace initiative. And Patton knew what that led to. He had seen armies stall. He had seen breakthroughs wasted. He had watched opportunities close while commanders debated maps. To him, Montgomery's claim wasn't about the past. It was about the future being quietly redirected. This is why Patton didn't challenge Montgomery in public. That would have turned him into the problem, confirmed every stereotype. Instead, he internalized the insult and converted it into pressure. If credit could be taken, then success had to be undeniable, overwhelming, impossible to reinterpret. Patton pushed harder. He drove his forces forward at a pace that made headquarters nervous. He exploited gaps aggressively, sometimes ahead of clear authorization. Not recklessly, but decisively. Every mile gained was an argument. But this only deepened the problem. Because from Montgomery's perspective, Patton's behavior now looked exactly like what he feared. A commander acting independently, creating situations that demanded accommodation. For Montgomery, this wasn't brilliance, it was instability. So the more Patton tried to prove his value, the more he reinforced the case for controlling him. Headquarters found itself trapped between two logics. One said, speed wins wars. The other said, control prevents disaster. And neither side trusted the other to stop before going too far. Patton also understood something deeply personal. Reputation inside HQ was cumulative. One narrative victory leads to another. One framing decision influences the next. And soon, the story becomes self-sustaining. If Montgomery was now the architect, Patton would become the executor. Useful but replaceable. Effective but monitored. That terrified him more than any enemy counterattack. So Patton's anger wasn't loud, it was focused. It manifested as relentless pressure, as refusal to slow down, as an almost obsessive drive to stay ahead of the narrative. He wasn't trying to embarrass Montgomery, he was trying to outrun the story. But stories don't get outrun, they get rewritten. And inside Allied headquarters, the rewrite was already underway. Because now every success Patton achieved raised a dangerous question. Was this proof of initiative, or proof of the need for restraint? And that question could not be answered in Patton's favor anymore. The rivalry had moved beyond words. It had become a structural problem. Once trust fractures, it doesn't announce itself. There are no formal declarations, no documents, no sudden breakdowns. The system keeps functioning, but it functions differently, more carefully, more slowly. And inside Allied headquarters, that shift was immediate. Decisions that once moved on instinct now required justification. Requests that would have been approved on reputation alone were sent back for clarification. Language hardened. Orders grew longer. Ambiguity was avoided, not because clarity had improved, but because no one wanted to be blamed later. This is how headquarters split, not into factions, but into filters. Every plan now passed through an additional layer of interpretation. Not, is this effective, but who does this empower? Not, will this work, but how will this be perceived? Those are lethal questions in a war that demands speed. Montgomery's camp emphasized coordination, sequence, risk mitigation. Every advance had to fit into a larger, coherent picture. That picture was clean, deliberate, and reassuring, especially to political leadership. Patton's camp emphasized exploitation, initiative, the belief that disorder in the enemy was an opportunity, not a liability. That philosophy was harder to explain in memos, harder to defend when something went wrong. So the balance tilted, not because one side was right, but because one side was easier to justify. Headquarters began defaulting to safety, to plans that minimized embarrassment rather than maximizing disruption. And that change was subtle enough to escape immediate notice. But the effects accumulated. Supply allocations became points of negotiation. Fuel shipments were delayed or redirected to maintain balance across the front. Requests for rapid concentration of resources were questioned in the name of fairness and coordination. No one said no outright. They said, not yet. And not yet is the most dangerous phrase in warfare. Because every delay gave the enemy time to adapt, to dig in, to reconstitute reserves, to turn chaos back into structure. Allied planners knew this intellectually, but emotionally, they were constrained by the rivalry. Supporting Patton too openly risked undermining Montgomery's authority. Supporting Montgomery too rigidly risked stagnation. So they compromised. Compromise felt responsible, reasonable, balanced, and it bled momentum. Meetings grew longer, discussions more abstract, responsibility more diffused. When something worked, it was credited to the system. When something failed, it was attributed to individual deviation. That asymmetry mattered, because it taught commanders what behavior was rewarded. Caution became safe, aggression became risky, not on the battlefield, but in reputation. And once commanders begin protecting their reputations, initiative evaporates. This wasn't about Patton alone anymore. Other commanders noticed. They adapted. They waited for clearer signals. They synchronized more carefully, even when speed might have paid off. Headquarters had become cautious without admitting it. The rivalry also poisoned information flow. Reports were framed to support narratives. Emphasis shifted subtly. Risks were highlighted or downplayed, depending on who would benefit from the interpretation. This wasn't deception, it was self-preservation. No one wanted to be the officer whose recommendation empowered the wrong philosophy. And that is how command cohesion collapses. Not through mutiny or defiance, but through hesitation. The most dangerous consequence wasn't delay, it was misalignment. Field commanders pushed for speed, headquarters pushed for control, and the gap between them widened. Patton felt it acutely. Orders arrived that constrained movement without acknowledging opportunity. His warnings about lost momentum were received politely and filed away. Montgomery, meanwhile, saw confirmation of his fears. The system was strained. Coordination was fragile. This was exactly why control mattered. Both men were responding logically to the same environment, and both were making it worse. Because once a rivalry reaches this stage, there is no neutral ground. Every action reinforces one side or the other. Headquarters tried to hold the center, to balance, to mediate. But mediation is not leadership, and war punishes indecision faster than it punishes error. The enemy didn't need to understand Allied politics. They only needed the pauses, the moments where exploitation slowed, the windows that closed while approvals moved through channels. By the time the cost became visible, it was already baked into the system. The breakthrough had created opportunity, the rivalry had consumed it, and the split inside headquarters was now structural, not personal. By the time the war reached its final phases, the damage was no longer traceable to a single moment. There was no document that said, "This is where unity failed." No meeting where someone admitted that rivalry had altered the course of decision-making. Everything still functioned. Orders were issued. Advances continued. The enemy was defeated. And yet, inside headquarters, something fundamental had changed. Montgomery emerged with authority intact. In some circles, strengthened. He had positioned himself as the architect of order in a chaotic coalition. The general who could be trusted to manage complexity, to prevent disaster, to keep the alliance from tearing itself apart. From one perspective, he succeeded, but success came with a hidden cost. Because authority gained through narrative rather than consensus is always provisional. It depends on continued validation, on the absence of failure, on the silence of those who feel displaced. Patton, meanwhile, never fully recovered his narrative ground. He remained effective, dangerous, feared by the enemy, but inside headquarters he became a problem to be managed rather than a force to be unleashed. His speed was admired and constrained. His instincts were valued and questioned. Momentum was no longer assumed to be an unqualified good, and headquarters needed both men at their best. That is the tragedy at the center of this story. Montgomery wanted unity, Patton wanted freedom, and Allied headquarters needed a synthesis that it never achieved. Instead, it chose stability over risk, control over exploitation. And while that choice did not lose the war, it shaped how the war was fought and how much opportunity was left on the table. The breakthrough that should have unified command became a fault line, not because of what happened on the ground, but because of how it was claimed afterward. Credit became a weapon. Once that happened, every success was suspect, every failure was political, and every decision carried a shadow calculation about perception. The real damage was not emotional, it was operational. Because war rewards clarity of intent, and rivalry muddies intent faster than any enemy action. In the end, history simplified the story. It turned Montgomery and Patton into symbols. One cautious, one aggressive, one orderly, one reckless. Those labels are comfortable. They absolve systems and blame personalities. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The Allies won despite the rivalry, not because they managed it well. The command structure survived because it was strong enough to absorb dysfunction, not because it resolved it. And that should worry anyone who studies war. Because coalition conflicts are becoming more common, not less. And the temptation to turn narrative into leverage has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. This story is not about who was right. Montgomery was right about control. Patton was right about speed. Headquarters needed both, fully empowered and fully trusted. Instead, it got something weaker, a system that functioned but hesitated, that coordinated but slowed, that advanced but argued internally about why. The Allies beat Germany, but inside headquarters, the fighting never really stopped. And that is the real legacy of the moment Montgomery took credit for Patton's breakthrough.